Please pray with me. May the words of my mouth and the meditations of all of our hearts be music to your ears, O God, our strength and our Redeemer. Good morning. Bread used to be one of those simple things. It was the staff of life. It built your body in 12 amazing, miraculous ways according to Wonder Bread, and found its way to the table for every meal in one form or another. Bread was the basic. Everybody ate bread. If you were considered somebody that was dull or not very interesting, people of a certain age will remember that they referred to you as exciting as a slice of white bread. Now, however, bread is a more complicated thing. If you have issues with gluten, if you have allergies, if maybe you don't like white bread, prefer whole wheat, if you're trying to lose weight, bread is something you go out of your way to avoid. Like a few things in our life that were staples or traditions, these things have changed, become more complicated, have added dimensions that we don't necessarily always understand. When you gather a large group of young people in a room and are required to not only feed them, but feed them well, it makes for a complicated thing. Veganism, lactose issues, gluten, and the general idea that youth are sometimes picky eaters, you make for a beautiful but very complicated table. On this year's mission trip to San Diego, or more specifically Imperial Beach, which is just south, we had a large group, 31 in total. Phil Dion, Allison Faison, our children's director, and myself, along with pastors Teresa Cho from St. John's Pres, and Maggie Henderson from Old First Pres. Both Branch and Eva Bender, who are participating in the service today, are members there. We led a disparate group of middle and high schoolers, young people that represented the full spectrum of God's kingdom on a very long journey. One that was physically demanding, emotionally charged, and spiritually uplifting and confusing. And yes, sometimes our spirituality tugs us in both of those directions at the same exact time. Our typical work day included carpentry, painting, mixing cement, digging post holes, using power tools. We stained wood. We did anything possible in the community that involved a lot of heavy, hard work in a climate that was unfortunately not conducive to our being able to work hard. As San Franciscans, as people from the Bay Area, 90 degrees and high humidity is not necessarily anything that we flourish in. But we stayed hydrated, we applied plenty of suntan lotion, and as you can see, we lived. During our time, we sang, prayed, danced, talked, and listened. We met the mayor of Imperial Beach. Some of our group went to a city council meeting. And if you were surprised by the totality of all of those things, then you've probably already surmised that our days were long. We awoke at 6 or 7, and bedtime was probably more accurately around 11 o'clock at night. In a gym, belonging to the Boys and Girls Club, with boys on one side and girls on the other, and no air conditioning. I truly felt my age, and that is not only true of the adults, but also for all of our kids. In Henri Nouwen's Bread for the Journey, this morning's passage speaks to sharing the abundant love. Nouwen says we must go out because we want to share with all the people the abundant love and hope, joy and peace that Jesus brought to us. He goes on to say, what we have received is so beautiful and so rich that we cannot hold it for ourselves, but we feel compelled to bring it to every human being we meet. Our reading this morning from John talks about bread, but not so much about the bread that we saw earlier that I showed the kids. I think about that bread, and I think about the Samaritan woman at the well, and the crowds that shared in fish and loaves, more bread, and wonder why and how we process these stories individually. Water that once imbibed means never being thirsty again. 2 small baskets of food that somehow feed a host of hungry people. How are we to receive stories like this without being just a little bit skeptical? Our big day this week was Adventure Wednesday, where some of our group crossed the border, while a second group, the one that I was a part of, went to the Tijuana estuary to work, and then we met up with 2 Border Patrol agents named Robbie and Ron. These 2 guys had taken time out of their day to come and meet with us and to answer all of our questions. We come from a place where we don't see these people, we don't see these men, and we don't know them. And so sometimes with all of the news that's going around, it's really easy to judge them, to think that we somehow know them. But when you sit down and talk to these men, you see loving husbands. They both had daughters, and they loved their daughters. They were respectful. They were kind and thoughtful. They thought that their job was important, but for all of the right reasons. And so I felt a certain joy at being in their presence because I had an opportunity to meet someone, or to meet 2 people that it was easy for me to think of them in a way that was completely at odds with who they actually were. As I said, they were patient, forthcoming, and honest about their work, and all in all seemed like really decent men. People that you would not be surprised to see at Calvary. After we talked, after they answered every question that the kids had, after we came to understand how they came to this place, they escorted us up to the friendship fence. Is that an oxymoron? Friendship fence? While we were there, we came face to face, or more precisely, face to fence, and we saw our friends through squares that might be 1/4 of an inch, maybe ½ an inch at its best. And we looked at our friends through this fence, and we were able to take our pinky and put our pinky through holes in the fence, and somebody would touch us from the other side. And what I want to ask you to do right now is turn to your neighbor and touch them with your pinky. Imagine that you haven't seen your son or daughter, mother or father, you haven't seen your grandmother or grandfather for a very, very long time, and now they are here. They are in front of you, but they are not really in front of you because there is this thing that is keeping you apart. Imagine that you haven't seen them for an extended period of time. Imagine the tears of joy. Imagine the grief in knowing that that fence is such a barrier. That fence is accessible by a path that's about 1.5 miles. A lot of times cars are not allowed to drive up there. When the weather changes, certainly no cars are allowed because the estuary abuts this area. And it floods. And still, people come. In the worst weather, rain, flooding, and they come. Little children, old people, and they walk up this hill, through the mud, through the rain, to get to a fence, to see someone they love, and they are allowed the contact of a pinky. At that fence, at that moment, that small touch seemed so important for us. After all, small touching is still touching. Our conversation that night and going forward kept that fence and the pinky touch on our minds for the rest of the trip. Back to that. I led a group of 6 hardworking youth, and we quickly developed a bond. Eva was in my group. One of the youth seemed different right from the start, but to us it wasn't in a bad way. We thought maybe he was shy or introverted, and so each of us took time to find a way to get him comfortable with us. Over the course of a couple of days, he changed. He became responsive to us. It felt like he was starting to learn how to love us as we loved him, unconditionally. He was a nice kid, and he was different, but what does that mean? Day by day we made progress, but unbeknownst to us, he was acting out in some very troubling ways with some of the other younger campers. Even with some of our group. In the end, the decision was made to send him home, and that broke our hearts. Our last working day, we spent a good hour and a half talking about this lonely young man and trying to better understand and empathize with what he was doing and why. In the end, we decided that this young man was someone in our group that we saw quite differently than the others. We saw a lonely, frightened young man who did not only know how to give love, who did not only know not how to give love, but not how to receive it. We have made a decision as a group to find a way to reach out to him, and perhaps through the courage of our love for him, we will find a way to connect, and perhaps even provide him with the sort of love that he has not previously experienced. Our group was blessed with doing the evening devotion on our last night at the camp, and we made a decision, affirmed by everyone in our group, that we would find a way to address that. And so we told the story of the Good Samaritan. We saw a young man in a completely different way than the rest of the group. And that's often the way that things work in our world. Perspective shift and change, and sometimes what you see is not what I see. It doesn't make either one of us right or wrong. We just need to create a space where that dialogue can happen enough so that we can at least understand each other. Courageous love is boundless, endless, and truly unconditional. When Jesus talks about the bread of heaven, he is not talking about that, but this. If we look at the water that Jesus offered to the woman at the well, or the bread and fish that fed the host, or bread that fills us up forever, we often think of them as miracles or even just metaphors. When we do that, we are denying the power that lies in each of these things and the actions that propel them forward. If we don't take the time to find the underlying power of these seemingly mundane things, we are missing something incredibly important to us as children of God. These might be the gifts of God for God's people, but they feed us in a way that sustains our faith and moves us forward as Christians. The table is set.